So my name is Tomasz Walenta. I'm really happy to be here today to talk to you about visual communication, myself, my practice. Basically, I'd like to tell you a story of how I got here. So for this, I will start with the beginning, actually. And what I can tell you is that when I was about 14 years old, I was back then living in Canada because I'm Polish, but a Polish immigrant to Canada. So basically, I'm a little bit in between those two countries. I was walking on the street in Montreal, and I saw a Polish poster in the window of a gallery. And that day, I kind of fell in love, and I decided that I wanted to be a graphic designer. And I was about 14, 15 years old. I was in high school. When I finished high school, I started this in university prep school, which was 2 years long, and I started to study visual communication. Later on, I went on to study graphic design in Montreal. Once I finished my bachelor's, I started a master's, but this time in Warsaw. So I went back to Poland for 3 years to study there. And I started to teach when I was about 27 years old. I wrote my PhD thesis about visual language. And I can tell you that I call myself an illustrator, but to be honest, I feel more like a translator. So, sorry, I just had a little thing. My job consists of transposing meaning from one language to another. So like in this example, we have the word love or the concept of love, and I try to transpose this into an image, and I always add a little twist to that. After my studies in Poland, I went back to Canada, and I started to work as a poster designer for cultural institutions, mainly in Montreal, but also in New York and in Poland. And today, I primarily work as an editorial illustrator, and I have different clients in the United States. Well, this is Poland going into the Eurozone, and I guess people they find it funny. So yeah, I work mainly in the United States. This is actually an illustration for Newsweek Poland, but I work in Europe, in Canada, in the United States. And this gives me the opportunity to tackle different subjects and to develop different styles of illustration. Here is a mix of photorealistic elements and drawing. Here we have another flat color style that's more adapted to newsprint. Here we have a photo illustration style that I used for a couple of years when I was working for Time magazine. Some humorous drawing style for this kind of, this was a travel magazine. And I sometimes develop a style for particular projects. Like, for example, this one was for a magazine called Nautilus, and it was a series of 10 illustrations. So I kind of created this particular feeling for this client. Lately, I have been working for the Wall Street Journal. So there's always two versions of the illustration. There's the printed version, and there's the animated versions for the online. So we have the requirements for print, which is on a newsprint paper, so basically very flat colors and thick outlines because the registration is not really great. And just to tell you, the common denominator between these styles is basically the concept, because all these illustrations are based on an idea. And for me, that's the most important part. I do not really care that much about the aesthetics of the image. I could actually be happy just with the idea if somebody else would do it for me, because sometimes the greatest fun is to find the idea, basically. So I try to develop these different style variations for two reasons. want to give my clients a custom treatment so they kind of feel special. And I think it's actually a good idea to address each client individually because each client is different. So if you sell them always the same thing, well, it's not really maybe perfectly adapted to their needs. So there's always a custom treatment there. And two, to create diversity in my practice. And I think that this is really important if you're thinking long terms about our profession, because it's really hard to reinvent yourself. You know, you have a style, you have a way of working, and it's really hard one day to say, hey, I'm going to do something completely different. So basically, if you have different clients, they give you a pretext to change something in your work, and that way you can evolve and you can adapt to the different circumstances of the market. Practically, I draw by hand, and I work on the image in Photoshop. I really love technology, but I really also like to draw on a real piece of paper with a real pencil. And what matters most to me, well, it's the content that I can transmit, not really the tools I can use. And I find most of my pleasure, like I said, when I'm looking for ideas. So to summarize this, basically, I go from a simple pencil drawing to the final image. So this is what I drew, and in Photoshop, I added the rest. The typography also was made by hand, but everything is assembled in Photoshop, and this is something I developed. This is a technique just to save time, basically. So I kind of think in layers and work in layers. So I will never draw, if I have many elements, I will all draw them separately on different sheets of paper, then scan them, so I don't have to cut them out. How I structure my work. So my work process is the first thing I would like to tell you about. And it all starts with the initial engagement. So this means that I receive an email from a client with a project, with a budget, and with the deadlines. And if I physically can, I always accept all projects. And yeah, because it's really interesting to work on different subjects, and it allows me to be actually active in different areas. And also, it allows me to better my visual vocabulary. So I learn while I work. And I will talk about this a little bit later, but this is something very important for me, is to create as many images as possible, to have as many references as possible. Then comes immersion and incubation. So I read the stories or the text or the articles 3 or 4 times. And once I understand the subject to address, I start to look for ideas. And this is the most interesting part of my work. Eventually comes illumination. And I find the first idea. That's the hardest idea to find, because basically once you have found the first idea, it means that you have understood the subject completely, and then you can find remaining ideas, because I always present more than one, of course, to my clients. Then comes creative synthesis and first validation that I do myself, and this practically means that I work on sketches or ideas, and I eliminate the bad ones, and I try to get as close as possible to the final image, so my art director doesn't have any surprises, because if you send pencil sketches, you know, and then you work on the final, many things change. So basically, art directors are not really super happy when they're surprised, because they have a layout, they have a format, they have a certain space for your work. So basically, the best you can do to have a fluid flow of work is to give them something that is really close to the final image. Then comes the validation by the client, which is the second validation. And this means, in this case, for example, the client answered, go with sketch number 2. So they chose this one. Then I work on the finals. In this case, it's really easy. Basically, just rework a little bit the details. But sometimes it's that easy. Sometimes it's a little bit more difficult, because there are more elements in the illustration, and it's a little bit more time consuming. But basically, if you see the sketch on the left and you see the final on the right, they're pretty homogeneous, and you have the same basic shape, the same format, the same proportions. So basically my art director can work with the sketch and then eventually replace it with the final. And yeah, so now that you know a little bit about what I do and who I am, I'd like to tell you about the relationship between my work and my pedagogical method, because they're really tightly related. So, the discovery of the mechanisms behind my practice led me to develop this method, which is now what I actually teach to my students. And this happened in 4 steps over a period of about 20 years. So the first step was my first contact with visual language, because I was working, well, I was not working, I was back then studying in Montreal in a graphic design university or department, and we were doing graphic design, but we were doing things a little bit by chance, you know. And eventually I went to do my master's, and then I landed in Poland, and I went to the Academy of Fine Arts in Warsaw, and there I met this guy who was my professor, Lech Majewski, one of the assistants and also continuator of the teachings of Henryk Tomaszewski, who is the founder of the Polish poster school. This is one of Majewski's posters, just to show you an example. And back then I was a little different than today. And I worked like this. These were my illustrations. And these were inspired by images like this. Like I told you, when I fell in love with Polish posters, well, I started to mimic them, and I started to create images in a similar style. Basically, I wanted to become a Polish poster artist. I wanted to be a tortured Polish poster artist. The problem is I wasn't tortured, so it didn't really work. This is a poster I did actually for a student association in 1995. That was in Montreal for a student association. And I actually did many posters like this for student association just to have the pretext to do posters and to be able to create images. So when I arrived to Warsaw to study poster design, my images, my portfolio actually looked like this. I had no academic drawings, I had no paintings, I just have these illustrations. So the idea was to present these to Majewski in order for him to accept me in his studio, because that had how the selection worked, because I missed the entry exams. It's a long story, but basically I had to present my portfolio to all the professors at the academy, and if they accepted me in their studio, then the school would accept me for the master's degree. So Majewski accepted me in his studio, but on one condition. And this condition was this. Forget everything and start from scratch. So tabula rasa, you know. Majewski told me, yo, you come from Canada, you're trying to be someone else, you're romantically involved with Polish posters, but you're not this kind of guy, you don't have this personality. You're a Canadian, you're a funny guy, you should find your own style, you know. So forget about all this, because this is not you. So, well, I had no choice, I agreed, you know. I said, okay, I will try. And we got a lot of projects from Majewski, but just one was really decisive for me. And that project was a poster project, of course, and we were supposed to mock an aspect of reality. We were supposed to create a visual joke. And this was the time when, it was the 90s, huh? So it was the times where, when these warning messages started to appear on packs of cigarettes. And my idea was to make a joke from this warning sign. And this is what happened. So, believe it or not, it took me 6 months to design this poster. And it was a really painful experience, because I was bringing sketches to Majewski, and he was saying, this is shit, this is bad, this we should throw out the window, this we should burn. Are you sure you have You want to study this? He was really, really encouraging me, you know. And it was kind of a hard experience, but eventually I got so frustrated that I sat on my sofa and I drew this in 5 minutes, and it just flew from my hand. And it was really easy, and I showed this to him, and he said, "You see, you can do it." So I was really happy, because he tortured me for a long time, but this is the best thing that happened to me, because I actually discovered my own style, and I stopped trying to be someone else.
You should have the English translation.
The English translation is: "The Minister of Health warns that smoking after sex is great." So there you have it. So basically, this was the beginning, and this is when I started to think with images instead of with words. And by the way, this is a first poster that was accepted to the Warsaw Poster Biennale in 1998, and that was really cool. It's me with a beer posing there. Okay. After I finished my master's degree in Montreal, I went back to Canada, and I started to work for cultural clients, like I told you before. And I was working full-time as a graphic designer in a small studio to make a living. And my free time, I was designing cultural posters. So posters like this one, like this one. It was really a cool experience, wonderful people, and very nice subject. But there was a little problem. The problem was that all my clients had really good subjects, but they had no budget. So, like for example, this poster is a big black and white photocopy that I actually spray painted with a stencil in order to add color. And I was doing this in the basement in the winter in Canada, so you can imagine that it was pretty interesting to make 50 posters like this with a spray can. Basically, that's the beginning, and what this taught me is that I need to continue creating my images, because this is really what I like to do, but I also would like to eventually be able to pay my rent. So I asked myself, what can I do to achieve this, this objective? And the answer I found was editorial illustration. So my idea was to transpose my philosophy behind poster design to editorial illustration. But the problem was at that time that I didn't really understand what my philosophy was. I told myself that basically I would just make bigger posters, smaller posters, and they would be editorial illustrations. I would treat editorial illustration exactly like poster design, and I would try to adapt my way of thinking to, from poster to illustration. So I started to look for an agent. I didn't have an illustration portfolio, I just had a poster portfolio. And I was pretty lucky to find an agent in New York who actually believed in me, and she gave me a chance and started to show my work to her clients in the beginning, just to get an idea of my profitability or something like that. Then one day, I get a call from her around 6 in the afternoon, and she says, "Thomas, I have a really great news for you. I found you your first job, you know?" And I'm like, "Really? That's really cool." And she's like, "Yeah, it's really cool, but you should know this. It's a magazine cover. It's for tomorrow morning. And if you don't get published, well, you have to find another agent." So basically, no pressure. And yeah, I did many sketches that night, and eventually this one was chosen for the cover. It was actually printed. Today, when I look at it, I can't really believe it that they let me get away with that. But they did, and that's how my illustration career began. And that's also when I started to think that really what I was doing was translating instead of interpreting. And I started to see illustration as a language. Then comes step 3, from practice to theory. After about 15 years of working as an illustrator and a lecturer, because I started to teach when I was about 27, I felt the necessity to understand and explain the principles behind my work in order to be able to teach them better, actually. That was my objective. So I decided to finish my PhD. That's a really long story. It took me 14 years. But basically, I finished it. I started in 2002, and I finished in 2016. But I actually finished it, so... But this is another story. So for my PhD, I decided to create a manual that explained in a simple way how visual language works. And by the way, I became what I call, or what I am, which is a reflective practitioner. My contact with semiotics confirmed my feelings that illustration could be viewed through the prism of language, because since I was thinking of myself as a translator, I was thinking really about transposing meaning from one language to another. So this was my idea in the background of my head. You know, these are two languages, and I'm really a translator. So I began analyzing all the images I did during my practice, and everything actually that I wrote came from my practice and came from images that I had worked on and developed. And practically, I wrote 2 books for my PhD. The red book is about visual language, and the green book is about, it's actually a kind of a dictionary of visual signs. In my practice, it's translated now, but I think it's not worth reading anymore because I have a new version. In my practice, I designed posters and editorial illustration by using figurative signs, but this is not what I teach. You know, in my pedagogical method, I present a general theory of visual language, which is applicable to all levels of communication, and therefore all students also with your different interests. And this is how it all works. So there is the work process inspired by the heuristic process. Basically, by analyzing my work, the first thing I found is that my creative process that I thought was something magical that came from divine inspiration was actually written down in this book. And by reading this book, I got to feel that, well, I'm normal first, and 2, there's a structure behind this creative process. If you're interested, this is a nice, it's not very thick, so you can read it. And yeah, and gave me some confidence, because I actually saw that other people thought the same way I did and did the same steps I did in their creative process. So basically, here are the elements of the creative process. If you remember the little blue titles from the beginning. So this is the general discovery process. And this is part of what I teach to my students. Of course, the most important part of this process is illumination. So basically, how do we get to illumination? And again, I can tell you that the heuristic process can help, because we start, or I start, by identifying with the focus of inquiry. So when working on a project, I try to become the project. I try to live with the project. And I lend my mind to the project, so it becomes something that I'm identified with. Then comes self-dialogue, which is something I thought was kind of crazy before, because I was talking to myself while working. And when you read about people who talk to themselves, usually they're not so well, you know. So, but once I read that self-dialogue was a part of the creative process, or the heuristic process, I thought, okay, this is actually not a mental illness, it's part of the creative process. So what happens when you talk to yourself is that you can ask yourself many questions, and you can eventually answer them. And eventually, you get something that you're looking for. Then there's tacit knowing. So deep down, you know, there's something, a feeling, a gut feeling, and you just have to dig it out. And sometimes it's very deep, and sometimes it's just under the surface. You have to use your intuition because, like always, it's your best friend. You have to practice indwelling. So turn inward and seek a deeper comprehension of the subject by looking through your own experience. And this brings me to focusing and the internal frame of reference. And by this, I mean that when you focus, you basically think about your project all the time that's possible. You go, you take the bus, you think a little bit about your project. You eat with your parents, you think a little bit about your project. You go to the gym, you think about your project. And eventually, you will find ideas, and these ideas will come from you and not from Google Images or from Pinterest, you know? So it's kind of a nice way of working. And I think that the most important thing about this is that if you practice this way of creating, this creative process, you can induce creativity in moments where you're really not creative, because not every day, you know, you have the best ideas. So by using this kind of standard or pretty much standardized creative process, you can force yourself to be creative by making your brain work in a certain way. So that was the first thing I learned from my practice, but it's not the only one. The second thing that I learned, and this is in the book that I wrote between 2013 and 15, was basically that there is a structure behind visual language. And then I had the chance to meet Professor Ewa Satalecka and to be hired at the Polish-Japanese Academy of Image, well, I'm confused again, Academy of Information Technology. So then came step 4. And step 4 is from practice through teaching to theory. So how visual language works. So the first thing that evolved since my PhD, since the first book I wrote, is the fact that I have written my own definition of the sign, which might sound strange to you, but it's actually something that I'm really interested in. So a visual sign is a signifier expressed by a stimulus with an associated personal signified existing in cultural space-time and triggering references within a cultural and personal interpretant. This sounds very abstract, but I will show you an image. This model is based on Peirce's triadic model and Klinkenberg's tetradic model. But I reject these models because they're super confusing and they don't really visualize how the sign functions. My model looks like this. So you have the referent at the beginning when the sign was created. You have cultural space-time, which is the time on which the cultural space-time, in the sense that how the sign evolves through culture, because signs are born one day and their meaning evolves with culture, basically with time. You have the personal signified, which is the understanding of the meaning of the sign, the cultural interpretant, which is what your culture tells you about the meaning of the sign, and you have the personal interpretant, which is what you know about the sign. And the sign, in my opinion, is only a signifier dressed in a stimulus that travels through cultural space-time. So basically, this allowed me to tackle the grammar of visual language, because the grammar of visual language functions on these 3 levels. And these 3 levels are the levels on which the sign functions. So it's not a coincidence. So the structure of the sign gives us clues to the structure of grammar. But what interests me the most is how to combine signs to create meaning. And here I have identified 9 operations that allow us to combine signs. And I will give you one example for each of them because we don't have a lot of time, but let's just start with the addition operation. So the addition operation adds the signifiers and thus the signifieds of at least 2 signs. So here we have this image, which is composed of these signs. So the head, the drawer, the area of the brain, the colors, the multiplication, and the style, which is also a sign. And if we create a little formula for this image, well, it looks like this. This image is actually all these signs added together, and they create meaning by addition. Yeah. This is an image that's not from my work, so you believe me that other people also use this, which uses addition to express, in this case, love or burning love. Okay. The subtraction operation removes an expected signifier, thus changing the signified of the remaining signifier. This means, for example, this. We have the Last Supper, but some people are missing. And that's why this image means something. These are the signs that build this image. So Jesus, specific table, long one, plates, wine glass, the multiplication of plates, the colors, the line style, and the missing sign, which is actually the most important thing in this image, is what's not in the image. So if we create another little formula for this one, well, meaning comes from what's not there. So why aren't the disciples at the Last Supper? You can answer that for yourself, but I guess they just left. If you want to see another image that uses the subtraction operation, well, you can look at this. Something expected that has been removed, and that's where the meaning is. The transfer operation is based on the subtraction and addition operations. First, we have to subtract a signifier from a sign and then add a new signifier to this sign. The new signifier transfers its signified to the sign it was added to. So here we can have an image like this, which is built from these signs, actually 3 signs. So we have the man, we behead the man, we put the head of the donkey on the man, and then the man becomes a donkey. And there's a transfer of meaning between the donkey and the man, so the man inherits the qualities or the signifieds of the donkey. For a real-life example, this poster. So our very cute Mickey Mouse just inherited the tail of a rat, and with the tail, all the negative connotations that come with rats. And this is very, very simple, you know. Then we have the nullify operation, which is based on the addition operation, because all basically operations except one are based on the addition operation. So it adds the signifiers of at least 2 contractory signs, and in result nullifies both signifieds. An example of this, something that cannot work together. You cannot be evil and good at the same time unless you're American, you know. So this image is built from these signs. There's also a little transfer operation from the flag to the horns, because the horns become American by getting the USA flag sign. But basically this meaning here is created by the nullify operation, which nullifies the 2 signs, and it creates this kind of absurd message in our head, and this is where we start to interpret this and we start to understand the meaning. Practically, by Alain Le Carnec, it looks like this. How to nullify evil? By laughing. And it's the only way to nullify or to fight evil in graphic design or with images is with humor. And that's something that's actually really interesting, because most very powerful signs like Hitler or other signs that are very negative will always overcome any other sign except humor. So humor is the only way to fight evil in graphic design. It's true. The superposition operation is based on the addition operation. It adds the signifiers of at least 2 signs by superposing them, thus modifying the signified of the hidden sign. In other words, this image. And this image is constructed from these signs. It's a little bit it's a simplified version, but basically it's a construction of all these signs. But meaning comes from this superposition of sine 5 over sine 3.2. Sine 5 is the sport jacket, and 3.2 is the sport jacket, and 5 is the police uniform underneath. Another example here, very easy, superposition of water over a symbol. Eagle becomes a ship at the same time, and it's the end of the Second World War in Europe. You can imagine the rest by yourself, fascism sinking in blood or something like that. The scale operation is based on the addition operation, and it adds the signifiers of at least two signs, but changing their scale, thus modifying both signified. Example. So here we have these signs: a big man, a small man, a labyrinth, colors, and some texture. And if we find our little formula, it looks a little bit like this. Sine 1 is bigger than sine 2, and sine 1 is bigger than sine 3, which means that one man can look over the labyrinth, the other one can't. So the man who can look over the labyrinth can actually guide the other man. And this is suggested by the hand on the shoulder. That is some kind of helpful sign. An example from Pet Montserrat. This is President Trump, I think. All right, the invisible operation is based on the addition operation. It adds the signifiers of at least two signs, thus creating a third invisible signifier and modifying all signifieds. This means this. And this image, well, you can see fish bones, but they're not there. They're invisible. So this is the invisible operation. This is how this image is built. And our formula looks like this. So this invisible sign that's created by the negative space between the hands becomes the meaning of this image. And if you want to see another example, we have this one here, for example. All right. The compare operation is based on the addition operation. It adds the signifiers of at least two similar signs, resulting in the comparison of the signifiers and signifieds. In other words, something like that. This is really useful, for example, to talk about time, because one element comes from one time period, the other from another, and you can talk about generations like this. You can talk about the difference between cultures. Basically, there's a lot of things you can do. It looks like this. It's built from these signs. And the meaning comes from the comparison of these two elements. So one is from the past, one is from the future or the present, and then the rest we can interpret. Real life example from another person than me. So here we have the compare operation. All right, the last operation is the displace operation, and it's the only operation that it's not based on the addition operation. It's usually applied to a single sign. It displaces parts of the signifier, thus modifying the signified. And this is, one example from this is an illustration I did for Newsweek. It's built from these signs. So basically you have the logo of Google, and again, the logo of Google as a shadow, just to reinforce the fact that there was a previous state before it started to be displaced. So basically this is the formula, and meaning comes from the displacement. As another example, we have this flag. So basically it's one sign that has been in some way displaced, and that creates the meaning in this image. All right, so that was one interesting thing that I learned by studying my practice. But there's another interesting thing, which is the rhetorical figures of visual language. And these function on two levels. The conceptual rhetoric can be defined as the use of visual rhetoric figures that trigger meaning mainly by manipulating the signifieds of signs, and formal rhetoric can be defined as the use of visual rhetorical figures that trigger meaning mainly by manipulating the signifiers of the signs. So conceptual rhetoric and formal rhetoric. But before, let's just say that all images in general are visual poetry, because this is what we do. We are poets. And visual poetry is the creation of images that formulate a concentrated imaginative awareness of experience in visual language chosen and arranged to create a specific emotional response through meaning and form. But let's go back to our conceptual rhetoric, and this is built around these figures. Some of them are also, you can find them in normal rhetoric or the languages rhetoric, but some of them are specific to visual language. So the first one is the metaphor, and this is the main one because all images are metaphors. A visual metaphor is a figure in which a sign literally denoting one kind of object or idea is used in place of another to suggest a likeness or analogy between them. And as I said, the metaphor is the main rhetoric figure in visual language because all images are metaphors. The nature of an image actually is to be a metaphor because it's always a representation of the referent. So unless you take the horse from the field and you place it in your image, if you draw the horse, take a picture of the horse, or whatever, you model the horse in 3D, it's always a metaphor of the referent. So here's an example of a metaphor, which actually is the iceberg metaphor with the plastic bag. And it's the most basic and most present figure, rhetorical figure in images. Then we have the metonymy or analogy. So a visual metonymy or analogy is a figure consisting of the use of one sign for that of another, of which it is an attribute or with which it can be associated. For example, an apple as a metonymy or of the original sin. The apple here stands for heaven. You know, it stands for also the whole story of the Bible, and this is a part, only an attribute of the story, but this attribute stands for the whole. The synecdoche. The synecdoche is a figure consisting of the use of one sign put for the whole. So here, for example, this image, we have a synecdoche of China by the use of Mao. So this is about the uniformization of culture, the uniformization of the Chinese people into one mold or one model based on this person. Antithesis. So the juxtaposition of signs which are apparently or really strongly contrasting, like this, for example. Juxtaposition of signs that are really or strongly contrasting. The next one is the hyperbole, and the hyperbole is basically exaggeration, and here we have an example of that. Maybe it's not such an exaggeration, but it is an exaggeration. Then we have personification, and this is abstractions or objects represented with human qualities. So again, we have some humor and irony. Another figure, for example, appeal to emotions. Many ways of appealing to emotions. For example, sexually, you can appeal to someone's anticipation of pain. You can also appeal to the sense of aesthetics or beauty. And you can, of course, shock people if you want, or if you think it's appropriate for your client. Then comes wordplay. This is very particular to visual language, and it's actually not all wordplay that works in visual language, but this one works really well. And the last one, I think, is the surrealistic transformation. And here, well, everything is pretty much allowed. even painting on elephants, if this is something that you want to transmit. All right, now comes conceptual contrast. And this, sorry, that's the last one. And this is something like this. If we, for example, imagine the relations between Poland and Germany. Sorry. It's not me, it's the article. I'm just a translator. So, all right. So after this, we go into the field of formal rhetoric, and this is going to be a little bit faster. So here, formal rhetoric is about manipulating the signifiers of the sign. So basically, it's everything you can do with the formal qualities of the image. So first you have the directions. So the top is of course heaven, bottom is of course hell, left is the past, right is the future. That's because we write from left to right, and we go to heaven or to hell, you know. So this is how it works. Axes. So these are the main axes, which are here in blue. It's a poster, by the way. It doesn't really work all the time with illustrations, but you always have axes which can give you good focus points on the intersection. They are strong areas of the image, and if you place elements along these lines or near these lines, you will have a better perception of them than if they are somewhere else. Then focal points, basically you use these to create focal points for your image. So you have a reading order or a hierarchy of elements or signs in your image. So you guide the eye of the receiver to look somewhere first, somewhere second, somewhere third. Cropping. Just by cropping this image, we can suggest infinity. Just by cropping a hand and a little bit of elbow and a little bit of dress, you can imagine that this goes on forever. If it wasn't cropped like this, it would be just these people. Now we can imagine that there's an infinity of them. Composition. You can have a winner without a crown or without any sign other than composition. Basically the same elements looking exactly the same, but one is clearly the winner because the composition suggests. So color or the lack of color. Do you see them? Imagine white people dressed in white gowns standing near the American flag. So how to show the Ku Klux Klan without showing the Ku Klux Klan? Yeah. Texture. So here I call it formal poetry, so you can add texture to anything to give it a little bit more feeling. I don't really like texture, but sometimes I use it when it's appropriate. So here is a poster I did one day, and it was about a beach, so I got into texture because sand has texture and water has texture, and then it was an appropriate use of texture. Contrast, and here you have two contrasts. You have the black and white contrast. This is the rape of a black woman by a white man. It's an article that I illustrated in 2005 or 6. And color contrast that you can, it's not the maximum contrast here, but it's a symbolic contrast because the ear is red, which is Canadian, and the little devil is blue, and he's Québécois, you know, because it's French Canadians doing some messy things in the ears of the English Canadians. Typography, you can also use typography as an element like this, for example. He had a lot of hair, you know, so that was the idea. And we have the transition signs, and these are really interesting, and you can use them in a variety of ways. Shadows. Sorry. Why isn't it moving? Mirrors. Anything can be a reflection in the mirror. It doesn't have to be what is in front. It can be something different. Doctors that become patients. Screens also offer this ability of creating a different reality. Very boring subject. Create a little illustration about the evolution of Samsung TVs. That was the article, you know. So I had to think of something funny for that. Funnels and other similar things that you can actually put something in and you don't really see what's happening, but you can make something else come from the other side. It's a transition sign. Windows, doors, things that open or things that have another reality behind them. Surfaces, here we have water, so basically anything can be underwater or over water. You can have any kind of surface, a reflective surface that can have a reflection of something else. It's similar to mirrors. And now, to conclude, hopefully soon, the last subject I would like to talk to you about is vocabulary. And that's what I said in the beginning, that vocabulary is super important because here is an example of English vocabulary, and we all know our vocabulary because we all speak English since we're kids, you know, so we have a lot of words that we can use to express ourselves. And the same thing is true with visual vocabulary. These are the equivalents of the other words, but basically what I want to tell you is that if you imagine talking to someone in English, well, the more words you know, the better you can express yourself. The better you can talk, the better you can tell a story, the better you can go into details. The same is also true with images. The more vocabulary you have, the more you can say with your image. The more you can be precise, the more you can be subtle. And this is actually something that is the problem with young graphic designers, that they don't know their vocabulary. So it's like me trying to speak English, but I only know 200 words, and I should know 3,000 in order to be able to express myself. And the same thing works with signs, visual signs, is that if you don't know the meaning of these signs, well, you cannot use them. And that's a little bit a challenge. And there are actually two challenges in transposing meaning from words to visual signs, that they don't have the same definitions. Because, well, I'm not going to read all this, but usually language, natural language is very descriptive, and visual language is more metaphorical. And the other little challenge is that most people can read images, and that gives them the illusion that they can also write them. But it's not really true. And that you can see when you start to creating images, and when you're starting to create posters, you can see that people have a lot of trouble sometimes with choosing the right sign or knowing the meaning of this sign in order for other people to understand what they want. So to help with this problem, I created this book. And it's actually a little dictionary of visual signs. And it's a tool for inspiration and also to learn visual vocabulary. It's organized thematically around 18 major life subjects. And these are the words you can use, the words in the words, actually, the visual signs, the words that you can use to talk about the different categories. Presently, this book looks like this. So you have on top the generic sign, and then you have the definition of it, what you can use it for, and underneath you have examples of application of this sign. And this actually is arts and culture. This is animals. So I always give you the definition of the generic sign and then how you can use it with an integration into a poster or an illustration. And this is about human man and his representations and his accessories. So again, the same principle. Now this book is, I left it a little bit in the back because I'm rewriting the first book, but eventually when I finish this first book, I will create a website from this book in order for it to be searchable and also open source, and that other people can contribute, because I listed 250 signs, which is a little fraction of all the signs that you can use. So to conclude, from my point of view, an image like this is a visual sentence that is built from these signs. And when I talk about semiotics, well, you might think about what semiotics are, which is something analytical, because usually semiotics work like this. We go from form to content. We try to decode meaning. And this actually here is pretty easy because we're looking at semiotics from this direction. Some from form to content. We're trying to decode or to interpret an image that was created by someone in order to know what that person meant. My approach is completely different because my approach goes in that direction. It's not about decoding the image, it's about encoding the image from the content you want to transmit. So in this case, these are the answers. So basically, I'm not a decoder, I'm an encoder. And what I teach is also encoding and not decoding. To finish this time for real, I can say that I have a pretty critical point of view on reality. And then when I work, I always try to express my personal opinion on a subject, even if it's minimal, even if it's a little joke or something like this. And I think that it's something that's really important, and it's something that is given to us because we are artists. So we have, first of all, the tools, we have also the talent, and we have the forum to express ourselves. And we should really take advantage of this because not all people on the planet have this opportunity. So basically, when you're designing things, try to be involved in them because you have to take advantage of the fact that you can express your opinions and influence other people, and not everybody can do that. So it's a very important thing, and I think it's our responsibility as image creators to make an effort for the world because we have a forum. So as an educator, I would like to do basically two things: inspire people to use their voices in accordance with who they are. So if you have a certain life or a certain context, you can express yourself within that. If you're somebody else, you can express yourself basically in accordance with who you are. And second, to give universal tools so that people can express themselves in any direction they choose. And this is why I have created Applied Visual Semiotic class, so everybody can have the basics, the basic universal tools to express themselves in whatever direction they want. So this was my philosophy. Thank you very much.